Welcome to the Kimberlite Digital Technologies and Alternative Energy Investments webinar. My name is David Batt, President of Kimberlite Research. I'm glad you're here to join us today. Today, we'll be reviewing the adoption of digital technologies such as cloud and machine learning, as well as investments in alternative energy investments. In past webinars at Kimberlite, we've covered individual product and service lines like drilling, hydraulic fracturing, artificial lift, completions. If you'd like a copy of the prior webinars, just give us a quick email at kimberlite.com. Today, our findings are based on the voice of customer interviews and voice of the operator feedback across very many different disciplines of the oil and gas industry. For those of you that are a little bit less familiar with Kimberlite, I'll give you a quick background of what we do. At Kimberlite, each year, we personally interview 3,000 oil and gas users globally through one-on-one personal interviews. During these one-on-one interviews, we collect information covering over 70 different oil field products and services, ranging from formation evaluation to drilling to completion to production to subsea. So when we interview the drilling engineers or the completion engineers or the production engineers or the geologists or the subsea engineers and subsea managers, we collect feedback about which technologies are bringing them success, where are they planning to invest for the future. We also collect information on the oil field service company suppliers with whom they're using and how are those suppliers performing, so we can competitively benchmark the oil and gas industry. But today, we're going to be focusing strictly on the adoption of digital technologies and alternative energy investments. When we interview the geologist in our G&G software report, and the G&G software report covers very many different G&G and geophysical software applications, and we ask the geologists and geophysicists around the world globally an open-ended question: what emerging technologies provide you with the greatest potential to increase productivity, reduce risk, improve imaging? What's the next big thing for you? It's an open-ended question. You know, these 300 oil and gas operators that we interviewed for this particular study, they're free to mention anything that they would like. We read through their detailed verbatim comments, and what we find in the 2020 G&G software report, that machine learning and artificial intelligence is at the top of the list of the technologies that are going to be key strategic investment priorities for them in the future. This finding of 37% is up fairly significantly from the 2018 survey, so you can just see how fast the digitization uptake is taking place. Also, when we look at cloud adoption, in the 2020 G&G software report, only 22% of the respondents were currently using the cloud to access their G&G software applications. This is up very, very marginally from the 17% using the cloud in the 2018 report. The slow adoption rate to the cloud is in large measure to the recognition of the fact that you just don't lift and shift your applications to the cloud. For most oil companies, they have a tremendous amount of cost buried internally with their IT infrastructure to help support all of their needs for data and for the systems that they use. And when you move to the cloud providers are providing 100% of not only the software and maintenance, but they're also providing the IT support and security. As a consequence, when you lift and shift to the cloud, the operators recognize that they're going to have to pay 10, 20% more commonly to move to the cloud. And the reason why they have to pay more for those services is the cloud vendor and the new provider is actually providing all the IT infrastructure and support, as well as the services that they traditionally received. The problem is for the oil companies is they haven't relinquished this internal cost yet. Okay, so the total cost is going up, and that's really what's been really hindering the adoption rate of the cloud for many oil companies. Consequently, only about 7% and now 20 to 10% of the applications for the oil companies are accessed from the cloud today. That creates a tremendous amount of growth opportunity for the cloud providers, as well as the service companies that support these various applications. When you also talk to the oil and gas operators, you know, they do indicate and express concerns about security and privacy breaches. You know, you saw what happened with the Colonial Pipeline back in May, And so, security is certainly a concern. But keep in mind that the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons literally have thousands of folks every day, to lock down their systems and access. In many cases, they have much larger capabilities than any singular individual oil company independently. So the security concerns, I think, will begin to mitigate as we move forward into the future. Microsoft currently has the lead as being the leading cloud provider to the oil and gas industry based on the respondents that we talked to in the interview at Kimberlite Research. And also, the oil and gas operators do expect the cloud vendors to manage the software and applications in the cloud. But we also saw, and I skipped that slide just a moment ago, we see a big growth in the use of hybrid clouds. So that will continue to grow as well. And that's projected to continue to grow based on the future of the responses that we see from our respondents and operators. The reasons that are currently driving migration to the cloud are a couple. One, due to capital constraints, oil companies and other companies, as their needs grow for capacity, they're not budgeting to expand their in-house capabilities at the same rates that they've done in the past. A lot of the excess growth is being moved to the cloud. In addition, we find that there are several benefits of moving to the cloud. Obviously, you have access from anywhere. It enhances workflows and collaboration, fit-for-purpose computing, faster turnaround time. We do see differences, though, between the international oil and gas operators seeing stronger benefits and certain value propositions than North America operators. But it's very clear that the benefits of migrating to the cloud are quite significant. And although migration to the cloud has been really quite slow from 2016 to 2020, we do expect the migration to the cloud to pick up at an increasing rate from 2021 to 2025. When we move to machine learning and artificial intelligence, this is an area where most oil and gas operators that we interview globally do not have a high degree of familiarity with. However, it does continue to be a very key strategic theme and a strategic intent. It's certainly an area of investment priorities for the oil and gas operators worldwide. When you ask what expectations you expect to receive from machine learning, you can see that most oil and gas operators from our G&G software report in 2020 indicate that machine learning solutions can greatly aid processing, imaging, well log analysis, and a whole host of applications and activities. Given the stresses and strains that are on oil and gas operators today with reduced workforce and trying to get more work done with fewer people, trying to accomplish more with less, certainly the use of these digital technologies will play a role in supporting, not replacing, but supporting the roles that we humans play at the oil companies. So those results came out of the G&G software report from 2020. Fast forward to the beginning of this year, 2021, we produced another report for seismic data processing, again talking to geophysicists and G&G folks. And now when we ask about machine learning solutions, is your company considering this seismic data processing workflows, you can see how quickly this has shifted from 2020 to 2021 to where now you have nearly 70% of the operators indicating that machine learning, artificial intelligence type digital technologies are now being considered. We also conducted this seismic data processing report survey back in 2018. The response rate here in 2021 is twice the rate that we received in 2018. You also find that the major oil companies are tending to spend a disproportionate of their resources in-house developing their AI algorithms and technologies, whereas some of the smaller oil companies are starting to look to third parties for assistance in building out artificial intelligence technologies. In terms of processes, again, what you see from seismic data processing is you'll find that there's a whole host of modeling and complex velocity modeling, interpretational avenues and applications and activities that really can be benefited from the use of machine learning technologies. We also find, too, just like we saw in the G&G software report from 2020, that only about 22% of all Earth scientists are currently accessing and using the cloud for data processing, up from 18%. So again, the adoption rate from 2016 to 18 to 20, even into the early stage of 2021, has been a little bit slower than a lot of people have envisioned. But you can see that the major oil companies and the large independent oil companies are embracing it at an increasing rate. When you look at what share of the data being processed globally for seismic is being performed accessing the cloud, you can see very similarly what you saw for G&G software application access. It was pretty low, 7%, and it's up to 13% now. This compares favorably to the 7% and the 10% that I shared with you just a moment ago for accessing G&G software applications. Again, Microsoft is the leading cloud vendor and provider in this space. Moving forward, 38% of the respondents prefer to have their processed seismic data delivered to them via the cloud. That's not happening today. So again, companies like Schlumberger and CGG and others will be developing capabilities to increase this capability moving forward. When you ask about the importance to reduce the processing time for seismic data processing, large 3D multi-client shoots could take many, many months to process. That could be reduced to weeks or even single-digit months using automated workflows and using cloud technology. And so there's another big benefit to shortening the cycle times to get this data processed so they can be interpreted and it can support faster project timelines. When we ask the open-ended question again in the seismic data processing report, what technology has the greatest amount of success in improving image quality and resolution, to no surprise, full waveform inversions at the top of the list, but again, artificial intelligence, machine learning, albeit at 9%, is up considerably from where it was just 2 years ago, where it was barely even mentioned. Now we're going to turn our attention to a completely different discipline in the oil and gas industry, talking about subsea. And we just recently published last month Subsea Services report that looks at life of field services. When you talk to subsea engineers and subsea managers and subsea asset managers and you ask them where they've been experiencing success, if you go back to the first 2016 report we did, there was no mention of digital technologies. And then in 2019 report, 4% of the subsea operators mentioned digital technologies. And today, in the 2021 report, 13% of the subsea operators mentioned benefit from digital technologies, software data analytics, artificial intelligence is bringing success and improving subsea field, life of field economics. You also start to see topics like remote operations begin to be mentioned for the very first time. If you ask the subsea operators, oil and gas operators, to look out into the future, back in 2016, no one mentioned digital or digitization. In 2019, it was mentioned by 15%. And today, fast forward to 2021, the subsea oil and gas operators will tell you that digitization, data analytics, automation, remote operations, and all these types of technologies that are designed to bring efficiencies into the operations is really their number one investment priority moving forward. All electric systems are also heavily mentioned. When you ask the subsea oil and gas operators, where do you expect all these technologies to impact you, they will tell you that digitization and remote operation technologies will have a major impact on their operations. And when you ask for specifics about where these benefits are going to be realized, and these are open-ended questions, so we collect all their verbatims, but when we read through all of their comments, what we find is there's an extremely strong belief by the operators that data analytics and digitization technologies, machine learning and such, and improved monitoring is going to improve decision-making, it's going to lend itself to more reliable operations, and it's going to result in improved efficiency and speed. And so in the subsea world, you have some subsea oil and gas operators that monitor their subsea pumps. If they notice that a pump is getting ready to fail, rather than just let it fail and at current operating conditions, they may slow the pump speed down to extend the life of that pump by an additional 30, 60, or 90 days. This gives the supply chain organization and the suppliers time to react and get equipment mobilized all around the world to help minimize the downtime. Another example would be in the subsea arena, being able to monitor the formation of asphaltene, wax, or paraffin, either through reduction in flow rate or an increase in pressure, or you may actually physically observe asphaltene in topside equipment. That type of monitoring and assessment will alert the operator to increase the dosage rate of their wax and asphaltene inhibitor. They may have to significantly increase dosage rates to reestablish flow assurance. Being able to monitor and use predictive analytics to be able to predict when pumps will fail in the future or based on current reductions in pressure and flow, how much time do you have to be able to address the condition is continuing to evolve. Granted, most oil and gas operators are still in the very beginning stages of developing these capabilities, but they're beginning to experience successes which they can start to leverage, from extending from monitoring subsea pumps to maybe monitoring subsea chokes, to monitoring perhaps subsea connections on their flow lines for strain and stress. Remote operations obviously brings the benefits of having to send fewer people off-site. We find from many oil and gas operators, they tell us that having the data streamed into a remote operational center, you actually have more subject matter experts looking at your situation than you would if you had that 1 or 2 or 3 people on site. You have access to a lot of capabilities. You still send people off-site, but you just send fewer people. This reduces the safety risk, it reduces cost, and it certainly reduces carbon footprint now that we're in a lower carbon regulatory environment. The number one help that the oil and gas operators need to help accelerate and implement their digitization objectives in the remote operations is this whole theme of digitization is so abstract. It means so many different things to different people that they really need help in updating collaboration of what's possible technologically and what's not possible. In many cases, we can do things today in 2021 that really wasn't all that practical to implement just short 2 or 3 years ago. So the speed and the velocity at which this is taking place is really hard for many operators to really comprehend. And it really doesn't matter if you're a drilling engineer, a completion engineer, a geologist, or subsea engineer, subsea oil and gas engineer or manager, keeping up with the velocity of what the capabilities are. In addition, the oil and gas operators are looking for real-life examples of where these data analytics and predictive analytics and increased monitoring have been put into practice and have generated a meaningful result. Okay, so when we ask the subsea oil and gas operators where are they spending their money today in 2021, we'll find that monitoring and digitization is comprising nearly 19% of their services OPEX budget for subsea services. This is up significantly. If you go back to 2016, the digitization piece was only about 4% of their typical budget. They were spending a lot more of their budget on equipment and repair and maintenance and workovers and interventions. Today, in 2021, they spend more money on monitoring and digitization, and they spend less money on repairs, and they spend less money on workovers. And so we clearly see when the oil and gas operators tell us that their investment priorities are moving towards increased monitoring, increased use of remote operations, increased use of predictive analytics, that not only are they telling us they're going that direction, we actually see it in where they're spending their dollars. When we ask subsea oil and gas operators where they see the biggest return on investment in the subsea world, to no surprise, subsea tiebacks, cited by 40% in the 21 survey, 46% of operators in the 2019 survey, is yielding the biggest return on investment. So even in this most recent downturn of 2020, and even in the downturn of 2015, we saw that short cycle projects with tiebacks were ones that could be implemented and executed in a very short time frame and yield a higher return on investment. I think what's most important on this graph is at the bottom of the graph, where in 2019, only 12% of subsea oil and gas operators believed that they could receive a higher return on investment from their digital technologies investments. Today, that's up to 32% of subsea oil and gas operators believe that they either will or currently receive a high return on investment from their digital investments. So that's a big trend. And so clearly we see the move towards digital increasing at an increasing rate. I'm going to shift gears again, except this time we're going to shift gears into some of the alternative energy investments. When we ask the oil and gas operators about their future plans to invest in alternative energy projects, be it carbon capture, utilization and storage, geothermal, wind, offshore mineral exploration, or even do they even plan to do it, what we find is that the major oil companies are probably the most active in taking the lead. Maybe part of this is just due to the social pressure to try to establish a social license to operate. In many cases, the major oil companies are just, following where the incentives are. There's a belief out there that a lower carbon future is better for the climate. I know that's debatable, but regardless of where you stand on the topic, there's a tremendous amount of economic incentives for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, with tax credits that are expected to move from the $35 and $50 per ton level to even significantly higher levels. And so, a lot of these capabilities and know-how exist within the oil and gas operating companies, which is why carbon capture, utilization, and storage is really at the forefront. The know-how exists to be able to tackle these projects, to be able to construct the facilities to store carbon into subsurface reservoirs, either permanently or to use it for enhanced oil recovery. You can also see that many of the major oil companies are also investing in wind projects as well. In terms of where traditional oil and gas services play a role, even seismic data processing will be used to assess these alternative energy projects, help aid in site selection and in monitoring. And so, even though we'll continue to use fossil fuel for many decades to come, given the current emphasis of the low carbon regulatory environment, you can see that the major oil companies and the large independent oil companies are coming on board first. In large part, the national oil companies and the small and medium-sized independent oil companies are not moving so quickly with planned investments into the future. That may change, and we'll continue to monitor this. You oftentimes hear the topic about ESG, environmental social governance. And when we ask the oil and gas operators how important it is for their service suppliers to have a formalized ESG program, again, you can see that the majority of the oil and gas operators do see it's very important to have a formalized ESG program. I'm going to be summing it up here in a moment, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to send a chat message and we'll address the questions. But at Kimberlite Research, I shared with you many of the findings from talking to geologists and geophysicists from the 2020 G&G software report and the 21 data processing report. I shared with you some findings in talking to subsea engineers and managers from the 2021 subsea services report. Each year, we produce drilling services reports, completions, and production. When we talk to the drilling engineers around the world and drilling supervisors, in fact, you may see this when companies like Schlumberger and Baker Hughes report out their quarterly results, that about 80% of the wells being drilled and supported by Baker Hughes and Schlumberger are being remotely monitored, either for navigation control or measurement while drilling, rotary steerables. So the equipment's being monitored, navigation's being monitored to improve precision and accuracy of landing the well. And so that's a great example of using digital and remote technologies. When you come and talk to the completion engineers and the completion managers, you'll find, particularly in the offshore subsea arena, virtually 80 to 90% of the wells that are drilled will have downhole pressure temperature surveys and monitoring to be able to monitor downhole well conditions. When you talk to the subsea operators off to the right for the subsea equipment study for subsea trees, you'll find that there's a growing percentage of subsea operators wanting to deploy fiber optics through the subsea tree to be able to have advanced data analysis and analytics moving forward to better optimize the productivity of that well. Intelligent completions are typically being used in the high-value offshore wells. That technology has not yet made it to land. When you look at in production for artificial lift, even in U.S. land, you can turn on or off a significant portion of the electric submersible pumps remotely. You don't necessarily have to send folks to the field to turn on or off an electric submersible pump. A large majority of the wells that are on artificial lift are using automation. And so all throughout this chain, regardless if it's G&G, drilling, completion, production, artificial lift, and subsea, we see this increased use of digital technologies and remote technologies. Question. You showed that investments on geothermal is larger than wind. Is it possible to elaborate on this? Thanks. When you look at geothermal, geothermal tends to be very isolated in certain locations around the world where those investments are taking place. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is far more prominent. As you know, the way that the current tax credits work for carbon capture is you have to have a minimum of about 100,000 tons of CO2 per year. And there's lots of point sources all along the industrial corridors around the United States, particularly along the Gulf Coast. And so it's lots of candidates and locations for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Wind has been invested in at an increasing rate globally. California uses quite a bit of solar and wind. Out in West Texas, if you drive out to Marfa, you'll go for miles and see wind turbines all over the place. Geothermal tends to be a little bit more isolated, and I think that's why you see maybe a little bit more or less uptick on that. The other thing to think about for carbon capture is if you're going to permanently store carbon into the ground, technically that would be designated as a Class 6 well. There's only been 2 Class 6 permits issued by the EPA, to the best of my knowledge, in the history of the United States. It takes about 2 years from initial filing to permitting, so there are lead times. If you look at injection of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, there's lots of those wells out there, and that's a Class 2 well. And so being able to inject CO2 for enhanced oil recovery is also has economic incentives on the tax credits that I think will drive more and more oil and gas operators towards carbon capture utilization. Geothermal will probably grow, but I think geothermal right today is more isolated in certain sectors around the world. Any other questions? Well, again, I'd like to thank your attendance today. In Kimberlite Oilfield Research, when people ask us to do a study on digitization, one of the first questions we ask is, what do you mean? What sector of the oil and gas industry do you want to talk about digitization? And they typically will say, all of it. We want all of it. So when we conduct our drilling services reports, or our completion services reports, or our artificial lift services reports, or our subsea services reports, or our formation evaluation reports, when we talk to geologists, drillers, completion engineers, production engineers, and subsea equipment asset managers and engineers, we'll ask them each and every time, for the most part, their plans for use of digital technologies in remote operations. That's the most accurate way for us to be able to thread the feedback across these different disciplines to get a holistic view as to what's happening digitally and what's happening in terms of advancements in the use of data analytics for objective analysis and predictive outcomes. It is still early days. Oil companies are all in different stages of the learning curve, if you will. Interesting enough, we've come across some operators that Well, see, David, we've been monitoring our subsea pumps for 10 years. We have a very strong history of the value. Other oil companies will say, David, we don't have any subsea pumps to monitor, so we don't really have any experience in that. But we're just beginning to dabble in monitoring subsea trees. I think where the broadest adoption has been is with drilling wells. They use remote operations support to send fewer people off to the rigs. This was driven by COVID, and it will stick post-COVID. And we also see an increase in given all the wells that produce an artificial lift, not being able to go out and service those wells individually every day, to be able to monitor them remotely is becoming increasingly important in order to drive costs down and efficiency up. And so all across the board. One more question. Carbon capture can be injected as gas or forestry is the last one considered. I'm not understanding the forestry, but there is anthropogenic sources of CO2 or man-made CO2, if you will. But today, natural sources of CO2 are really some of the most economic. Sourcing CO2 from natural reservoirs is today the most economic. Man-made sources would increase the cost. But there's currently, as you know, there's legislation out there to take these tax credits from $35 and $50 per ton to over $100 per ton under certain situations. And so each of you, including myself, the taxpayers are paying for all of this. Don't know if it's going to really be economic in the end or actually achieve the objectives that some people believe they will achieve. But there's certainly a lot of investment going off in that direction. I want to thank you again for joining. Please feel free to reach out to Kimberlite directly if you prefer to have more one-on-one discussions or if we need to delve into a particular area of interest. And if we have any information to assist you, we will. In the meantime, we welcome your gift of feedback. And for any of those of you that work for oil companies on the line that have participated in our past surveys, we thank you for your participation. With that, we'll sign off here at Kimberlite. Thank you for attending. Bye now.